June 1964, London. Paul McCartney woke up at 4 in the morning with a melody in his head. He couldn't remember where he'd heard it. He couldn't remember who wrote it, but it was perfect, complete, finished, and it terrified him. The room was dark. Jane Asher slept beside him in their Wimpole Street flat, her breathing soft and steady. Outside, London was silent except for the occasional rumble of an early milk truck making its rounds through the empty streets. Paul lay still, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, holding his breath. The melody was playing in his mind like a radio he couldn't turn off. Da-da-da, da-da-da, da-da-da. It was beautiful, melancholic, simple, like something that had existed forever, waiting to be discovered, like finding a fossil that had been buried for 1,000,000 years. But Paul was certain, absolutely certain, that he hadn't written it. He must have heard it somewhere, on the radio while driving through Liverpool, in a club during one of those endless Hamburg nights, from another songwriter at a party. Because melodies this perfect didn't just appear in dreams, they belonged to someone, and that someone would sue him into oblivion if he claimed it as his own. His heart was racing now. The melody kept looping, over and over, insistent and demanding. Each repetition was identical, perfect, unchanging. Paul couldn't let it disappear. Slowly, carefully, trying not to wake Jane, he slipped out of bed. The wooden floor was cold under his bare feet. The floorboards creaked. He froze, listened, then continued. He moved through the darkness like a burglar in his own home, feeling his way past furniture, past the wardrobe, past the chair with his clothes draped over it, toward the upright piano in the corner of the room. His fingers found the keys in the darkness. One note, then another, and there it was, the melody from his dream, note perfect, flowing from his hands as if they'd played it 1,000 times before, as if it had been waiting his entire life to be remembered. Fa M major. Simple, devastating. He played it again, and again, each time expecting to recognize it, each time more convinced he'd stolen it without knowing, each time more afraid that tomorrow he'd hear it on the radio and realize he'd unconsciously memorized someone else's masterpiece. "What are you doing?" Jane's sleepy voice came from the bed. "I had a dream," Paul whispered, not looking away from the keys. "There was a melody. I need to remember it. It's 4 in the morning. I know. I'm sorry. Go back to sleep." But Paul couldn't stop. He played the melody over and over, committing it to muscle memory, making sure it wouldn't vanish like most dreams do in daylight. His fingers knew what his mind didn't, that this wasn't theft. This was something else entirely. Something that came from a place deeper than memory. The melody was sad, not devastatingly so. Just melancholic. The way autumn feels, the way goodbye tastes, the way his mother's face looked in the photograph on his father's dresser, present but unreachable. By the time the sun rose over London, painting the rooftops orange and gold, Paul had played the melody 200 times, and he still couldn't place where he'd heard it. The next morning, Paul arrived at Abbey Road Studios with a question that would haunt him for weeks. Does anyone recognize this? The studio smelled like cigarettes and coffee and old wood. The red light above Studio 2 glowed softly. George Martin, the Beatles producer, stood near the mixing console with his arms crossed, his tie perfectly knotted despite the early hour. John Lennon lounged on the studio couch with a cigarette dangling from his lips, his legs stretched out. George Harrison sat cross-legged on the floor, tuning his Gretsch guitar. Ringo tapped a rhythm on his knee, already hearing music nobody else could. Paul sat at the grand piano. His hands trembled slightly. He played the melody. Silence filled the studio. Not the uncomfortable silence of confusion, the heavy silence of listening, of paying attention. "Well," Paul asked when the last note faded. "Whose is it? Whose is what?" John replied, taking a drag of his cigarette. "The song. The melody. I heard it somewhere. I can't remember where." George Martin tilted his head, his expression thoughtful. "I've never heard it before." "You must have. It's too good to be new." John laughed, smoke curling from his mouth. "Ego much, Paul? I'm serious. I didn't write this. I dreamed it. Someone else wrote it. I just need to figure out who before I make a fool of myself." But nobody knew it. Not George Martin, who'd spent decades in the music business and had heard every song ever recorded. Not John, who consumed music like oxygen and could identify a B-side from 3 notes. Not the engineers sitting behind the glass. Not the session musicians who wandered in for a cup of tea. Not anyone who walked through Abbey Road that day. "Maybe," George Martin said carefully, choosing his words like a man defusing a bomb. "It's yours." Paul shook his head. "Things like this don't just appear. Songs take time. They evolve. This came complete. That doesn't happen." "Sometimes," Martin replied quietly, "it does." John stubbed out his cigarette. "If you didn't steal it and nobody else wrote it, then congratulations, Paul. You're a genius. Accept it and move on." But John didn't understand. He never understood. John was the intellectual, the artist, the one who wrote In My Life and Strawberry Fields Forever. Paul was the pretty one, the one who wrote She Loves You and I Want to Hold Your Hand. Catchy songs, commercial songs, not this, not perfection. For the next 3 weeks, Paul McCartney became a detective investigating his own subconscious. He asked everyone, at parties in Mayfair where champagne flowed and record executives told war stories, in clubs in Soho where new bands played to empty rooms, on crackling transatlantic phone calls to musicians in Los Angeles and New York. He played the melody on acoustic guitar in dressing rooms before concerts, his voice tentative, apologetic. He hummed it to songwriters in pubs. He even called his old music teacher in Liverpool, the one who'd taught him basic chords when he was 12. "Sir, do you recognize this tune?" Nobody did, but Paul couldn't write lyrics to a stolen song, so he used placeholder words, silly words, words that would make the melody familiar while he searched for its true owner. Scrambled eggs. Oh my baby, how I love your legs. Didn't mean to make you cry, but that scrambled egg has got my eye. The Beatles started calling it the Scrambled Eggs Song. Still looking for the real writer? John would tease during rehearsals, grinning like a cat. It can't be mine, Paul insisted. It's too complete. And it was. Most songs evolved. Started as fragments, a verse here, a chorus there, grew in stages like plants, got rewritten 12 times, had arguments over bridge chords. But this melody had arrived fully formed, like Mozart claimed his compositions did, downloaded from somewhere else, perfect and untouchable and finished. John didn't understand Paul's anxiety. If you can't find who wrote it, it's yours. Take it, use it, stop being so bloody precious about it. But Paul had spent his entire life in John Lennon's shadow. John was the clever one, the one everyone said would be the real success when the Beatles ended, the intellectual who read books and made political statements. Paul was just the pretty face who wrote love songs and smiled for the cameras. If he claimed a masterpiece that turned out to be someone else's, John would never let him forget it. Besides, Paul thought late one night, staring at the ceiling, nothing this good happens to someone like me. June turned to July. The Beatles toured Europe. Paul played Scrambled Eggs in hotel rooms. In Paris, he played it for a French songwriter in a smoky cafe who swore on his mother's grave he'd never heard it. In Amsterdam, he played it for a radio DJ backstage who listened with closed eyes and called it magnifique, but couldn't name the composer. In Copenhagen, he played it in a dressing room for a Danish musician who wiped his hands on a towel and asked, "Who wrote that?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out," Paul replied. The musician shrugged. "If it's yours, it's yours. It's yours. Don't waste it." But Paul couldn't shake the feeling that he was forgetting something, some distant memory floating just beyond reach. His mother used to play piano before she died. Had she played this melody? Had it been on the radio in October 1956 when he was 14 and his world was ending and nothing mattered except the fact that Mary McCartney was gone forever? He couldn't remember. The memory was like trying to hold smoke, but he also couldn't let it go. Late one night in a German hotel, Paul sat alone with his acoustic guitar. The room was dark except for a lamp in the corner. Outside, Hamburg glowed with neon and sin, but inside there was only Paul and the melody. It flowed out again, unbidden, inevitable, like breathing, and for the first time he allowed himself to imagine, what if it really was his? What if genius didn't always announce itself with trumpets and fanfare? What if sometimes it just whispered in a dream at 4 in the morning? The thought was both thrilling and terrifying, because if this melody was his, it changed everything. It meant Paul McCartney wasn't just the cute Beatle, he wasn't just John's sidekick. He was a songwriter who could create something timeless without even trying, without struggling, without John's approval. But that possibility felt too big, too impossible, too much like hope. August 19th, the Beatles returned to London for another recording session. George Martin pulled Paul aside during a studio break. They stood in the hallway outside Studio 2, the muffled sound of Ringo practicing a drum fill bleeding through the walls. "Have you found the owner of your mystery song?" Paul shook his head. "No. Then I think it's time you accepted the truth. Which is, it's yours, Paul. It always was. Sometimes the best songs come from somewhere we don't understand. Mozart said his music came to him complete. Beethoven said he heard symphonies in thunderstorms. Maybe you're in that company. Maybe some people are just channels." Paul looked at his shoes. "And if the lyrics aren't good enough for the melody?" George Martin smiled. "Then you'll rewrite them until they are. But you'll never know unless you try." That night, Paul sat in the Wimpole Street flat with his acoustic guitar resting on his knee. Jane was out at the theater. The house was silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, and Paul finally stopped asking whose melody it was, because it was his. It had always been his. The lyrics came quickly. Not scrambled eggs. Something real. Something about loss and longing and the way memory plays tricks on you. Something about his mother dying when he was 14 and the world never quite being right again. Something about Jane. Something about every relationship that ends too soon. Something about how yesterday always looks better than today. Yesterday, all my troubles seemed so far away. Yes, now it looks as though they're here to stay. Yes, oh, I believe in yesterday.
The song poured out in less than an hour. 3 verses, a bridge, a resolution, everything the melody had promised, everything it had been waiting for. Paul played it through once, twice, 3 times, and for the first time since that morning in June, he wasn't afraid. The Beatles gathered at Abbey Road Studios to record Paul's new song, but when they arrived, they realized something unusual. This wasn't a Beatles song, it was a Paul song. "There's no drums," Ringo said, looking confused. "No harmony vocals," John added. "No electric guitars," George finished. George Martin had arranged a string quartet, 2 violins, a viola, and a cello. Classical musicians in formal suits and ties sat stiffly in Studio 2, holding their instruments like weapons, looking uncomfortable in a room that usually smelled of rock and roll and cigarette smoke. "This is a solo piece," Martin explained. "Just Paul, his acoustic guitar and strings." John lit a cigarette, his face unreadable. "So we're not playing? Not this time." For the first time in Beatles history, 3 members of the band would sit in the control room while one of them recorded alone. It felt wrong. The Beatles were a unit, 4 parts of one machine, 4 voices creating something bigger than themselves. But this song demanded something different, something intimate, something that couldn't exist with drums pounding and electric guitars wailing and 4 voices harmonizing. This song needed to be alone. Paul sat on a wooden stool with his Epiphone acoustic guitar cradled in his arms. The microphone loomed in front of him like a confession booth. The red recording light blinked on. The string quartet lifted their bows waiting for his cue, and Paul sang the song he'd found in a dream. His voice was soft, vulnerable, nostalgic for something that never existed. The strings swelled behind him like memory itself, beautiful and sad and irreversible. Each word landed like a goodbye. Each note carried weight. In the control room, John stood with his arms crossed, listening. His cigarette burned forgotten between his fingers. George Harrison watched through the glass, completely still. Ringo tapped no rhythm. For once he had nothing to add. None of them said anything. But they all felt it. The moment when Paul McCartney stopped being the cute Beatle and became something else entirely. Something they didn't quite understand. Something that made John shift uncomfortably because he knew, in that moment, that Paul had written something he never could. When the take finished, silence filled Abbey Road Studios. The kind of silence that follows church sermons. The kind that means something important just happened. Then George Martin pressed the intercom button. "That was perfect, Paul. Should we do another?" "No, that's the one." The Beatles didn't want it as a single in Britain. It didn't sound like them. It sounded like Paul. But in America, Capitol Records released it anyway, and radio stations ate it alive. It went to #1 in 3 weeks, and it stayed there. The song that Paul thought he'd stolen became the most covered song in recorded music history. Over 2,200 versions by 2025, sung in dozens of languages, performed by everyone from Frank Sinatra to Elvis Presley to Marvin Gaye to Beyoncé. Classical orchestras, jazz trios, death metal bands, church choirs. A melody that arrived in a dream at 4 in the morning became immortal. 60 years later, Paul McCartney still talks about that night. "I woke up and it was there," he says in interviews, his eyes distant with memory. "Complete. I thought I must have heard it somewhere, but I hadn't. It was just there." People ask him all the time, where did it come from? He doesn't know. Maybe, he says, the best songs don't come from us, they come through us. We're just the ones lucky enough to catch them. But here's what Paul doesn't say, what he's never quite admitted in 60 years of telling the story. That melody scared him because it was perfect, and Paul McCartney, at 22 years old, didn't believe he was capable of perfection. He was the second best songwriter in his own band, the pretty one, the one who wrote love songs while John Lennon wrote art. Yesterday changed that. It proved that genius doesn't always announce itself with drama. Sometimes it just whispers, and sometimes the hardest part isn't creating something beautiful, it's believing you deserve to claim it. Paul spent 3 weeks trying to give that song away, trying to find its real owner, trying to prove he wasn't worthy of it. In the end, it gave him something more valuable than fame. It gave him himself. The melody that came in a dream became the most recorded song in history, but the real miracle wasn't the song. It was a 22-year-old boy learning to trust his own voice, even when that voice came from somewhere he didn't understand, especially then.